guess if you're reading this, I bought it. I hope that my passing has not distressed any of you more than necessary. Whatever its manner, pain, torment, or happening, I would have endured it as a final test to my character and being. You made me the man I was, and the parachute regiment had merely defined me to everyone else. I am incredibly proud to have been your son. I love you all very much, and I'm so terribly sorry.
The final words of a young man killed in the line of duty. He was at the bottom end of one of Britain's most powerful and controversial industries.
The gun was put in his hand by G4S Armoured Group.
Some of them should still be alive today.
You are a business at the end of the day.
Without them, my embassy would have had to close.
What powers do you have?
We don't have powers.
Tonight, Britain's private war.
Whoa! That was too close.
The armed sector of the private security industry is estimated to be worth globally as much as £400 billion. Where there's conflict, there are contracts. This is a programme about the outsourcing of war, the deaths of former soldiers that the public aren't told about, and an unregulated industry which is getting rich in all our names. Our story begins with the last wishes of a young man.
His will, I opened 3 days after he was killed, and there were a lot of poignant points in it. And I think some of the things he wrote and said I felt really quite proud of. I think they confirmed my opinion of him as a person.
That person was Nick Crouch. He grew up in a cliff-top house on the Norfolk coast with his mother Barbara, his father Clive, and sister Rebecca. His ambition as a young boy had always been to join the army.
Not just any regiment in the army, but the parachute regiment, which he, thought was, the best regiment in the British Army at the time.
I think he felt that it was a job he wanted to do and was very, very, very proud.
Nick served in the Paras for 6 years. He then decided to leave and retrain as a private security contractor. Nick was soon taken on by Armour Group, a British private security company which had contracts with the UK government. Those contracts were to protect embassy staff working in Afghanistan, as well as visiting diplomats and ministers. Work you may have thought was done by the military.
But there was Tony Blair, he looked after them, and then when he got posted to Helmand, he was also assisting in the protection of Gordon Brown.
These were government contracts?
Yes.
In his spare time, Nick also volunteered to work in a hospital, helping those on both sides wounded by the fighting.
He and another colleague of his used to sort of help out, doing some quite not complicated surgical procedures, but certainly things like bullet extraction and shrapnel extraction, stitching people up.
Nick then joined another British private security company. It was called Aegis. Aegis had contracts with the American government worth $293 million over 3 years to aid reconstruction in Iraq. Even though no longer a serving soldier, Nick felt he was still doing his bit for Britain and its allies. His job to protect staff from the US Army Corps of Engineers who were building a hospital in Mosul in the north.
I think he felt that health, a hospital, they needed it, was a worthwhile thing to have done, and therefore a worthwhile thing to protect the engineers. It was a lovely sunny day, and I was hedge trimming with a large machine, and a police car pulled up at the gate, and his first question was, "Are you the parents of Nicholas Crowe?"
And we knew straight away, that it was bad news.
It was the 19th of July 2010. Nick had been escorting the army engineers to the hospital when a man driving a truck packed with explosives drove into the convoy. Nick was killed instantly. Written in Nick's will beneath his final goodbyes to his family was a specific message he requested be made public about the use of private security contractors.
If I should be killed in Afghanistan or Iraq, and the media is interested, I would like them to know how I and all the other former soldiers contributed to the great game. I seek no personal glory, but many good powers and other ex-servicemen have died supporting these operations with little or no acknowledgement to their bravery. It is widely accepted that without us, the British and US forces couldn't operate.
The final wish of Nick Crouch is where our investigation begins. He wanted the public to realise the vital work that private security contractors do for the country, and the government to acknowledge the industry that he worked for. Yet it's an industry immersed in controversy and secrecy, and tonight we find out why. Operation Iraqi Freedom 2003, the bloody finale to decades of civil oppression, international sanctions and a succession of wars. The battle was won and Saddam was gone. The challenge now to rebuild a broken country. America announced an $18.4 billion fund to rebuild Iraq.
We will do what is necessary. We will spend what is necessary.
This is one of the largest non-military budget requests in American history.
It would mean rich pickings for the private security industry, tasked with guarding those responsible for the reconstruction. As the months progressed, security companies, the majority of them British, would come close to outnumbering the military. For those who bagged a contract, the financial rewards were huge. There were examples of small companies worth less than £50,000 at the end of the war in 2003, 1 year later valued at 15 million. Many doubled their turnover. In 2003, the collective annual revenue of British security firms totalled approximately £320 million. But by the following year, this figure exceeded £1.8 billion. If ever there was a 21st century gold rush, this was it. And that battle for lucrative contracts is just as fierce today, but they come at a price. The British military has always had a disproportionate number of Scots. But when the financial floodgates opened, thousands left the army to become private security contractors. Peter was one of them. He's asked for his identity to be hidden, concerned he won't find work again after speaking out. In the last 9 years, he's done 17 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan as a private contractor, protecting medical and food supply convoys, escorting ground troops and training soldiers. Whilst some contracts were for private industry, many were for essential British and American government work.
I was a contractor to protect and run convoys for the US Corps of Engineers, but we were reconstructing the electricity from Basra to Baghdad. You're over there as protection. You're helping the US military, whatever companies it's there, to do their job safely. Make sure they get from A to B and don't die in between. The military couldn't operate without the likes of us moving their equipment and, running the convoys, etc. Taking their personnel different places, protecting them. They just couldn't do it without us.
This is footage taken by Peter of a heavily protected convoy travelling through southern Baghdad. Most days he would take his camera with him. He gave me the footage of his time there. It was to be a revealing insight into the often secretive world of private security. He also gave me a copy of his diary.
Movies are shit. The sound of gunfire is completely different.
That was too close.
We're waiting to take an engineer from the Corps of Engineers to inspect the power lines. They're involved in the reconstruction of electricity to southern Iraq as Saddam ruined the power supply heading down to the Shia people in the south. I feel very vulnerable, as we've no weapons yet. There was no armoured vehicles even. There were soft-skin vehicles. We used to run convoys in local cars, 4x4s, but no protection, no body armour, nothing. You were handed an AK, maybe about 4 magazines. If you were lucky, you'd get a pistol. And that was it.
Peter told me he thought the desperate scramble by companies to win the big money contracts meant they often didn't have time to ensure the men were properly equipped. They were turning to local arms dealers to buy illegal weapons.
You could buy anything. It was like assault rifles, you had your AKs, you had pistols, ammunition, grenades, RPGs. It wasn't until the money started coming in for the contracts that they would say, okay, maybe you should get some body armour now. Maybe we should upgrade the weapons.
It's impossible to verify everything Peter's telling me, but just before this interview, 2 British private security contractors were arrested for buying illegal weapons, although in this case no one was saying the private security company was to blame. As well as inadequate equipment, Peter levelled a more serious accusation at the industry he's worked in for over 9 years. He told me the pressure for companies to fulfill contracts sometimes led missions to become more and more dangerous. The contractors call them black runs because they know there's a high chance they'll be attacked. In this footage supplied by Peter, we see a private security team being shot at by insurgents. You can see the bullets hit the side of the vehicles. The tyre comes off one of the cars. It's too dangerous for them to stop. This time, no one died. Others weren't so lucky.
A friend of mine was tasked to take some equipment to a US military camp from Baghdad. The locals said, we can't go here, it's far too dangerous. But the company itself, because of the contract, and the US apparently needed this equipment, the company decided to go. Halfway there, the team was completely surrounded and ambushed. We were listening to it on the open mic. My friend was screaming for backup. We could hear them all just dying, one by one, till eventually my friend was killed, shot in the stomach.
If it was that dangerous and they knew it was that dangerous, why did they go?
If your boss turns round to the contractors, the companies, and says, look, we can't do this, then it gives them a bad name for a start.
In modern conflict, there's often little distinction made between military and private security. Contractors doing essential work for the British and American armed forces are often seen as legitimate targets and are losing lives. Many may recall the horrific scenes from Fallujah, which were broadcast around the world. 4 mutilated and badly burned bodies are dragged through the streets. A baying mob then hangs them for the world to see. Many thought they were soldiers. They were in fact private security contractors, ambushed, then brutally executed. In a war zone, death is an accepted risk, but as security companies seek to keep profits high, is there a danger that that commercial pressure will turn risk into recklessness? Dundee-born Bob Shepherd served in the SAS for 20 years, witnessing some of the world's bloodiest conflicts. After leaving, he worked as a private security contractor in both Iraq and Afghanistan. As well as working on commercial contracts, he was also paid by the British government to help protect state-funded projects. He was soon to discover the lengths some companies would go to keep their lucrative contracts.
Some of these companies, they know which are the dangerous routes, which are the less dangerous routes. And I'll give you one example. A logistical manager who knew that I wasn't happy, he wasn't happy either, and he decided to show me what he had on his computer. They were running convoys in Iraq, and they knew, because they had a colour code, what the chances were of certain convoys running certain routes and certain convoys running other routes. And they had a convoy route that they knew had an 80% chance of being hit every time they went out.
This means some of the companies knew which routes were the most dangerous for convoys. I wanted to know how many security contractors had died doing their job. Military deaths are recorded officially by government, but for dead private security contractors, there's no such database. Instead, various unofficial websites like this one keep only partial lists. We found 55 British deaths recorded in Iraq alone. There's no list for Afghanistan. The Foreign Office awards nearly all private security contracts on behalf of the government. They said they didn't keep a record of contractor fatalities, instead relying on the companies to monitor incidents and report back. Officially, they could only tell us of 7 deaths which they'd been alerted to by the companies.
We know when a soldier dies, it's all over the newspapers, it's on the TV. But we never know when security contractors die. So you've got lads coming back in the bellies of commercial aircraft being repatriated to the UK blindly. They're hidden away, they're ferried off to a quiet family funeral, and the companies are telling him what a brave soul he was and how great he was for the company.
Bob has his own theory as to why the deaths of private security contractors aren't made more public.
For the companies, it's bad for business. For the government, it's hiding the true cost of these conflicts. If the British taxpayers knew the total numbers of people that had died on behalf of British security companies in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, they would be shocked.
What Bob told me next may go some way to explaining why it's so difficult to get to the truth of what happens.
There have been instances that I'm very privy of where, a convoy's been blown off the road and people have been killed. And the convoy commander, if he or she is still alive, will be the one that writes the post-operation report or the post-incident report. That report is then taken away by the company and it's sanitised to ensure that the company looks good. Not only does the family of the deceased see the sanitised report, if indeed they see a report, the people working for the company, the contractors that are on other contracts around the country don't even see the real report. They'll get to see the sanitised report. So nobody learns from it.
I spoke to other contractors who told me similar stories of incident reports being changed, and a Senate hearing in the States heard whistleblowers tell of documents which contained lies. Appalled by all that he witnessed, Bob turned his back on the industry.
I am an angry man. I'm bitterly disgusted because there are some very decent young lads who I met, ex-paras, ex-marines, ex-infantry, ex-corps, and they're dead now. And I know, deep down, that some of them should still be alive today.
Every year, the government spends millions employing private security companies to protect British projects around the world. Now, that's taxpayers' money. So I want to know exactly how much it's costing us. We asked the Foreign Office how much it spends. Since 2003, it's paid out £454 million. And that doesn't include further local contracts awarded to security companies in the countries themselves. Sir William Patey was Britain's ambassador in Afghanistan until June of this year, a post he also held in Sudan and Iraq. He believes the work of private security companies, or PSCs, in areas like the Middle East are vital. Hello, Sir William.
Sam, hi.
Nice to meet you.
Welcome. I hope the journey wasn't too arduous all the way from where... My embassy would have had to close without a PSC, or reduced a minimum number and drawn troops away from their duties in Helmand to protect us.
In August last year, the headquarters of the British Council in Kabul was attacked by insurgents. Sir William says it was private security contractors who saved the lives of his staff.
They kept firing as the terrorists were coming through the gate, while the other members are getting my staff to safety and keeping them under cover until the special forces could come. Without the private security companies, the British government wouldn't be able to operate in Afghanistan, or the American government. Even the military rely on the private security companies to provide security for convoys, for static guarding. There just aren't enough troops to do all that. So, if they had to do all that, they would be much less effective. It would be too expensive. It would just be, and therefore, you would be driven to PSCs on grounds of efficiency and effectiveness.
So that's what it comes down to, money. I mean, it's cheaper for the British government to take in a PSC contractor than use the military.
Absolutely. I mean, and the taxpayer should applaud that. In a time of austerity, you want to give the highest degree of security at the minimum cost.
Just days after the interview, it's announced that the number of British troops are to be cut by 20,000 over the next 8 years.
We have to change and adapt, and that means letting go as well as building anew. Thinking innovatively about how combat service support is provided, using more systematically the skills available in the reserve and from our contractors.
We're already relying heavily on private security. Less military will mean an even greater reliance. And more contracts for the companies means more boots needed on the ground. The European Security Academy on the outskirts of Poznan in Poland. It's the biggest security training centre outside the United States. And it's where increasing numbers of Britain's latest recruits to the world of armed private security come to train. John Geddes is former SAS. After leaving the military, he became a private security contractor. He now runs one of Britain's largest training companies and brings the students here to Poland as part of the course. Around a fifth of those he trains come from Scotland.
Ronin Concepts is a broad spectrum security company. Our main bread and butter work is close protection training for the emerging industry at the moment.
Every month, dozens of recruits are trained by him. Almost all are serving soldiers looking to leave the forces and get into private security.
First thing we'll do is 5 rounds from a standing position.
The bulk of the course takes place in Hereford, but because of UK firearms legislation, the final week is here in Poland, where the students undergo intensive close protection weapons training. It's a skill which requires a different mindset from that of a soldier.
It's getting them out of the habit of an aggressive stance, going into a combat role, and giving them the mindset of being in a defensive situation where the priority is to get your clients out of the ambush area and back home safe.
The course these men are doing costs almost £4,000. It's a lot of money for those on a soldier's wage. But I was to discover something rather surprising about exactly who funds the students who come here to retrain.
Advance. The Army fund these guys to come and do this course right from day one. That's the individual's choice whether to go for a course that just covers the executive protection or a company like us that covers both. The essence of this kind of training is they go into civilian life into a direction which suits their psychology. Nice tight formation. Advance.
Of all the students on John's course, 85% will have the bill paid for them by the government. It's part of their resettlement programme to prepare them for civilian life.
With your principal, get them in a diamond formation and move out.
It means that as the military sheds jobs, the government is actually funding the transfer of soldiers into the private security sector.
Okay, position.
Peter McCalla is former Polish Special Forces. He's responsible for training the British students on a wider range of weapons than they'd normally use in the military.
Okay, it's live. Okay, hold the weapon, yep. Good. Okay, take the mag out. Okay, come. It's very good. I'm already scared. Where you been training? See that around us? Right in the centre.
What kind of money can you expect to earn in a day?
You're probably looking at between, depending where you're working, in what part of the world, £150, £300 a day.
How does that compare to a military pay?
Well, if you're a private soldier, you're probably on 16 or 17 grand a year. So if you've got guys that have been in 5 or 6 years in the military, even as lance corporals, they're still going to make more money doing hostile environment work in Afghanistan or Iraq.
As private security contractors?
Yeah, without a doubt. And that's why a lot of guys are getting out.
I'm in the Marines, serving a 4-5 commando up North Broth. I've been there 8 years now, all my career. Once I've done this course and got my licence, I'm going to try and put in for early release. Get out as quick as I can, get out of the military and then hopefully get a good contract.
In only a matter of weeks, John's students will be providing protection in some of the world's most hostile areas. It's now time for the men to put into practice what they've been taught.
Move right! Move right! Move right! Move. Nice and tight, keep it tight. Go, 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 go!
Get my breath back. That's awful. Loud. It's so loud you can't concentrate on anything. And I wasn't even firing the guns. And one thing you have to keep telling yourself is this is a training exercise. And nobody's firing back. The government has to make 20,000 soldiers redundant, so paying for men like these to retrain is a clever move. It means the military gets the job cuts it wants, and the private sector the government relies on so heavily gets an even larger pool of highly trained contractors. But despite all the training in the world, in an industry with no statutory regulation and massive commercial pressure, will the lives of men like these be put at unnecessary risk?
Okay, so this is our International Operations Centre, which monitors most of our operations around the world.
Bill Freer runs the UK-based security company Pilgrims Group. They're contracted by the government to train all Foreign Office staff around the world, and they also provide protection overseas for media organisations like the BBC. Yet when it comes to bidding for the big money protection contracts, it seems a solid reputation may not be enough.
The frustrating thing for companies like Pilgrims is that we have a 100% safety record, touch wood. We've never had any injuries, we've never lost anybody, or clients or our own people. And yet, when we're in competition with other security companies who quite honestly have a list as long as their arm of things that have gone wrong, the questions come at us about our price, not about the quality of service that we're offering and why we may be a little bit more expensive. So we are, in almost all cases, marked and judged on what price we're offering.
Are you ever asked, how many have you lost? Is it really just down to price?
We include those facts in our tender bids, but we are very rarely asked that question, if ever. That's what the whole RMC...
Bill told me he wasn't prepared to compromise his company's reputation just to get a contract. Is it difficult to be principled in this industry?
Yes, if you want to survive and you want to be commercially successful, it's very difficult.
To be principled?
Yes. Yeah, and some of our competitors have grown much faster than us, quadrupled in size in comparison to our growth. And that's partly due because of our principles and because we won't cut corners.
It's all about the bottom line. And that's all they're interested in. That's all these big companies are interested in. And I've heard them say that in theatre, where they've spoken over breakfast, visiting the contracts that they have on the ground, in their suits, saying it's all about the bottom line.
So the contract and the profits to be made are everything?
Absolutely.
The allegation that profits are being put before lives is shocking, to say the least. But an unregulated industry means there's no forced accountability. So I have no way of proving that what I'm hearing is true or not. Surely, though, if some of these contracts are being funded by taxpayers, they should be open to a higher degree of public scrutiny. Many of Britain's private security companies are entirely professional, but sometimes even the most reputable players can succumb to commercial pressure. The biggest security company in the world is British firm G4S. You may have heard of them. They're the company which ran into a spot of bother for failing to deliver on its contract to provide security for the London 2012 Olympics.
We've had a fantastic track record of service delivery over many years in many countries, but clearly this is not a good position to be in. But we feel we've got to make every endeavour to deliver as well as we can on this contract.
Mr. Buckles, it's a humiliating shambles, isn't it?
It's not where we'd want to be, that is certain.
It's a humiliating shambles for the company, yes or no?
I cannot disagree with you.
Looking on the internet, it's easy to see that G4S has a wide repertoire, doing everything from prisoner transport to reading your gas meter. It even has its own corporate song. A lucrative aspect of its multi-billion-pound business is providing armed protection in hostile environments such as Iraq and Afghanistan. There it also operates under the name Armour Group. I managed to make contact with a man who'd worked for G4S Armour Group as their country manager for both Iraq and then Afghanistan.
Hi, pleased to meet you.
He now lives abroad but agreed to fly back to London to meet me. He was responsible for ensuring the contract was fulfilled on the ground.
First of all, the office in London needs to win the contract. They then pass that back to the in-country team to deliver the contract. You were normally given a 28-day window to ramp up. And what I mean by ramp up is to bring in all the manpower, all the vehicles, all the resources, everything that was required to run that contract so that 28 days later it would be fully operational. Now if it wasn't fully operational at any time, the company start losing an allowance every day. They lose part of the contract money, which on average for one particular run could be $16,000 a day.
In those 28 days, the company also has to ensure that every man being deployed is properly vetted. Were there occasions when these checks weren't able to be done because of time constraints?
Well, there were probably 2 or 3 occasions while the men were still being vetted whilst on the ground. Somebody may not come back from leave. We may have a serious casualty, so we've got to replace that expatriate operator as soon as possible. The pressure's then on, do we lose the money, or does London get the man out there straight away?
Bill told me the commercial pressures placed on them were enormous.
You are a business at the end of the day. So like any business, for the operators and managers on the ground, you're constantly being given pressure to make money and make more money. And not cut corners, but cut areas where you can manage without extra men, without the extra equipment.
Did that sit comfortably with you?
My focus and priority has always been operations, welfare and discipline, and looking after the operator on the ground. And then when they throw into the works as well, yes, you're that, but constantly you've got to look for more profit, more margin.
But there are consequences.
Yes. The consequences are that you end up doing far too many things with far too few people. And that's when mistakes can be made.
Were these mistakes brought about by massive commercial pressure to fulfill contracts responsible for the murders of 2 G4S contractors in Iraq? The borders town of Peebles. Childhood home to Paul McGuigan, who grew up here with his family. At the age of 19, he joined the Royal Marines.
He was proud to wear the uniform, and he just loved what he was doing. He was always polishing his boots. That was always the big joke. He was always polishing his boots the whole life. He thought it was incredible, and he was so proud to be serving his country.
After 7 years in the Marines, Paul decided to retrain as a private security contractor. Like Nick Crouch, he went on a course paid for by the government as part of his resettlement package. Soon he was out in Iraq and working on a government contract.
He was happy to be where he was, helping to rebuild the country and the kids and that were out there. He loved the feeling he was helping. He was in his element.
Another contractor who was out on the circuit was former paratrooper Danny Fitzsimons.
Danny was the one who always wanted to be in the army. He used to send Eric letters when he first went in the army, and some of the letters were fantastic. Dad, I'm doing this, and I in the training I was first when we did the run, and I've done so many press ups, didn't he?
Yeah.
And so many sit ups.
Didn't I?
Oh yeah.
On the 9th of August 2009, Paul McGuigan's parents received a phone call from his fiancée.
She said, there's been an accident, Paul's dead. I said, no, don't be silly, how could there be an accident? She said, but there couldn't have been an accident. Paul wasn't working, he wasn't on duty.
Eric's phone went with a message, and it just said, I think your Danny's in trouble in Iraq. And it was one of Danny's friends. He didn't know exactly what had happened, but he said, I think he shot somebody.
There'd been some sort of altercation in the camp, and that Paul and an Australian, Darren Hoare, had been shot and killed.
Well, he rang back a couple of minutes later and said to me, if you Google the Washington Post, it's in the Washington Post. It said that there'd been a shooting in Iraq, and it named Danny as having shot 2 men in Iraq.
Unbelievably, what the families had been told was true. Just a few hours after picking up Danny Fitzsimons from Baghdad Airport, Paul McGuigan and his colleague were dead.
He was shot 3 times. Twice in the chest, and they weren't killer shots, and then a gun was put into his mouth and he was shot in the mouth, which severed his spinal cord.
security guard who killed 2 colleagues in Baghdad is due to find out today if he'll face the death penalty.
Guard Danny Fitzsimons has been sentenced to 20 years in an Iraqi prison.
He's the first Westerner to be put on trial in Iraq since the fall of Saddam Hussein.
Danny Fitzsimons killed 2 of his G4S colleagues. He pulled the trigger of that, there's no doubt. But there's a mountain of evidence about Fitzsimons which should have set the alarm bells ringing for G4S long before he was ever taken on. Before joining G4S, Danny Fitzsimons had already done 4 stints in Iraq as a private security contractor, but he'd been sacked from the last job after punching one of his clients. Back home, he was also facing criminal charges of assault and a firearms offence, and he already had convictions for possessing illegal ammunition and robbery. I managed to get hold of a psychiatric report compiled for Fitzsimons' legal team for one of the criminal cases. In it states Fitzsimons had been administratively discharged from the army on psychological and disciplinary grounds. He was also suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder brought on by witnessing colleagues' deaths in Kosovo and Iraq. So, not only was Fitzsimons still on bail, not only was he supposed to be under the supervision of probation officers, but he was also under the care of a community psychiatric nurse. Despite all of this readily available information from army records, from medical records, from criminal background checks, G4S still took him on. But that's not all. We've discovered that G4S was sent warnings about Fitzsimons in the days leading up to the killings.
All as we heard at that particular time was that a new chap had arrived. He'd gone into location, straight into location in the green zone, and less than 36 hours there'd been a shooting incident where this particular individual had shot 2 expats and killed them, and the words used at the time were executed. As the information was coming through, then one of my very good operators, he came to me and said, I've got some confidential information, I can't speak to you because you're my main manager, I need to speak to the country manager immediately.
The operator told the country manager that he'd sent several anonymous emails to G4S in London, alerting them to Fitzsimons' background. We managed to track down the man who sent them. He's still working in the Middle East and didn't want to be identified, but he agreed to let me have the emails.
I'm concerned that you've accepted to employ a violent criminal by the name of Danny Fitzsimons from Manchester. I am alarmed that he will shortly be allowed to handle a weapon and be exposed to members of the public. I'm speaking out because I feel that people should not be put at risk.
Three days pass. G4S fail to respond to the email. So concerned was he that his warning had gone unanswered that he decided to send a second one.
I am disgusted that this individual will gain a job with such a large company. It will just fuel his lust for violence. Surely he must have some duty of care to not allow this to happen. This is not the type of thing you would wish G4S to have to account for in the media.
Despite Danny Fitzsimons' deployment date fast approaching, the emails remain unanswered. He decides to send one last warning. Fitzsimons was already due in Baghdad.
Dear sirs, Having made you aware of the issues regarding the violent criminal Danny Fitzsimons, it has been noted that you have not taken my advice and still choose to employ him in a position of trust. I have told you that he remains a threat and you have done nothing.
But it was too late. Paul McGuigan and Darren Hoare are shot dead by Danny Fitzsimons. What if I told you that G4S had been warned about Danny before they employed him, and those warnings came in the form of several emails to the company?
And they still took him out there?
And they still clearly took him out there.
Well, I'd be so angry. I'd be absolutely distraught. I'd be...
Do you still have evidence for that? Yeah?
We have the emails.
Right.
They really need taken to task for that.
Why not heed such a strong warning? Yeah. Why not listen to that warning?
Surely alarm bells should have started ringing there.
Now, we did ask G4S for an interview, but they declined. They did, however, give us this statement.
Although there was evidence that Mr. Fitzsimons falsified and apparently withheld material information during the recruitment process, his screening was not completed in line with the company's procedures. Our screening processes should have been better implemented in this situation, but it is a matter of speculation what role, if any, this may have played in the incident.
Regarding the email warnings, a spokesman told us,
We are aware of this allegation, but following an internal IT investigation, it is clear that no such emails were received by any member of our HR department.
It did not, however, say whether anyone else in the company saw them. Corinne and Jamie continue to mourn the death of their son Paul. Although the trigger was pulled by Fitzsimons, they know who they blame for the murder.
He fired the bullets, but the gun was put in his hand by G4S Armour Group. They put the gun in that man's hand. The people who we feel responsible, who we hold responsible for putting that gun in Danny's hand, are without a shadow of a doubt G4S. I want G4S to be charged with corporate manslaughter and be held accountable for what they did.
There's one very clear factor about the case of Danny Fitzsimons, and that is the state of his mental health. Now, the psychiatric reports point quite clearly to him suffering from some kind of post-traumatic stress disorder. In an industry which relies heavily on former military, where there's no mandatory vetting but there's this pressure to fulfill contracts, there's growing concern that more individuals like Fitzsimons may be taken on. A thought echoed in Peter's diary.
I have constant nightmares and flashbacks. Anyone who says they can go to a war zone and come home the same person is a liar. Tomorrow we're taking a colleague down to Basra as his mental state is shot. He's had enough. 1 minute I'm sad and feel like crying, then filled with anger the next.
When you looked around you on certain missions and you looked at the guys that you were working alongside, how many of them would you say had PTSD?
I think towards the end of my 5 years out there, yeah, there was quite a lot that had PTSD. We had an incident within the company and we lost a few guys, really close friends to us all at the time. And when they were killed, the US military decided to take us to the church within the Green Zone to speak about the incident, and they gave us all sheets of paper. and get questions on them about how we were feeling, if you felt, affected this one way or the other. We just looked at the paper and we just sort of laughed, because most of us could tick practically every box.
The latest figures estimate as many as 1 in 5 serving British soldiers is suffering from PTSD. Dr. Christopher Kinsey, who spent his entire academic career studying the private security sector, believes the condition is just as prevalent amongst contractors.
It's something that the industry has to deal with. It's something the government also needs to deal with. This could be, it's really, I think, potentially a time bomb waiting to explode. I think it's a very controversial industry, and I think the government is aware of this and would prefer not to tackle some of the issues it should tackle.
Such as?
Well, I suppose, first of all, openly acknowledging this industry exists and what it does, and rather than trying to keep everything out of sight, and that yes, it does need, for instance, regulation. We have self-regulation of the industry that is being driven forward by the Foreign Office. I think we need more than just self-regulation.
Despite spending almost £500 million on private security companies overseas in the last 9 years, the UK government has always shied away from formally regulating the industry. Instead, it's opted for companies to regulate themselves and for a trade association to develop and maintain the industry standards.
Are you a regulatory body?
We're not a regulatory body, we are a trade association, but we are formally partnered with government.
So what powers do you have?
We don't have powers.
So you're not a regulatory body and you don't have any powers?
Correct in that respect. The Security in Complex Environments Group is a voluntary regulation system, and so there is no formal requirement, or statutory requirement rather, for companies to comply with those standards. But what the UK government and the SCAG is seeking to do is ensure that those standards are recognised so widely across client groups that it becomes a commercial imperative for companies to comply with those standards.
I then asked him about the allegations that I'd heard whilst making this programme.
If there are companies that are allowing their men and women to work in a dangerous environment with inadequate equipment, forcing them to go on the black runs, asking them to sanitise reports, one could argue these aren't the kind of companies that are going to pay much attention to your code of conduct.
Arguably, that could be correct.
Does that concern you, though?
And I'm sure there will be some companies who would continue not to uphold the best standards of the industry. Of course, it concerns me a great deal, but what we're trying to do is to address that problem.
What will you be able to do to those companies?
If they continue to operate underneath the radar very little. What the majority of the industry is keen to do is to ensure that those industries who are behaving, or those companies rather, who are behaving less professionally, are identified and commercially disadvantaged. At the moment, signing an international code of conduct means nothing apart from, in fact, for some perhaps, a wish to differentiate themselves in the marketplace. In terms of substance of performance, it means nothing. What will mean a great deal is when the standards are in place and there's independent verification of those standards.
The International Code of Conduct was taken up by certain security companies for the simple reason that it would be madness not to. Because if they do, and if they sign up for it, it's another facade of legitimacy that they can give to potential clients.
It means nothing.
It means nothing. It's a facade. It doesn't help the contractors to do their job and to have the backing of the companies whatsoever.
And what would help the contractors in your mind is proper external regulation.
Totally.
In a statement, the Foreign Office said the voluntary system would help to raise standards globally. It said it was vital to work in partnership with the industry and other interested parties to effectively prevent abuses by PSCs abroad. Domestic legislation, it said, is not the answer, as companies could easily move offshore to avoid prosecution. In the last few weeks, at least 3 more private security contractors have been killed that we know about. For those still grieving, it's difficult news to take.
For anyone, the loss of a child is deeply significant. I liked the adult he'd become. He was fun, he was thoughtful, and I didn't have to imagine what he'd be like as my grown-up companion. And that we will miss.
I leave you with the words of 2 poets to remember me by, and I hope they will bring some comfort. The first is by Dylan Thomas. Do not go gentle into that good night. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at the close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light.
And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light.